Do you understand all of that?
A judge asked Caleb Flynn if he understood the 5 charges against him, including murder, accused of killing his wife Ashley Flynn. The judge asked Flynn whether he's a flight risk.
I just want to take care of my daughters. I'm not at risk.
The judge set Flynn's bond at $2 million. Tipp City police have not stopped working even after Flynn's arrest. I confirmed today that police towed both of the former couple's cars away from the scene for underside inspections. They returned those vehicles Friday. Police also confirmed they used a backhoe to lift a shed in the home's backyard to check under it. That could be part of a search for Caleb Flynn's gun. A detective wrote in police reports that he observed the center console to the 2024 truck was open as he was clearing the house, and that is the location that Caleb told him his gun was at. But despite canine searches, police drone flights, and lots of officer checking, there is no mention in reports or court documents of a weapon being uncovered. Meanwhile, that judge told Caleb Flynn that even if he does make bond, he will not be seeing his daughters.
You are not permitted to speak to them in any way, shape, or form. That includes electronic communications. You are not allowed to communicate through family members whatsoever.
There are things people say after a tragedy that feel rehearsed, words that arrive too easily, phrases that seem to explain everything while somehow explaining nothing at all. In the days after the death of Ashley Flynn, one statement would echo through interviews, court filings, and news coverage. A quiet sentence offered by the man who had lived with her, prayed beside her, and shared the routines of an ordinary life. Her husband, Caleb Flynn, would later tell investigators something simple, something almost mundane. "We had a fight that night. She asked me to sleep on the couch." It sounded like the kind of disagreement that happens in countless homes. A brief moment of friction, a temporary distance meant to cool emotions before morning restored normalcy. But sometimes the smallest explanations carry the greatest weight, because sometimes they are not explanations at all. Sometimes they are the beginning of a story that investigators must slowly dismantle piece by piece. And in this case, that single sentence would eventually sit beside other pieces of evidence. A text message sent to another woman, a crime scene that did not behave the way a burglary should, a timeline that seemed calm where panic should have lived, and a life that ended inside a home that by every outward appearance had once been safe. In the quiet city of Tipp City, the death of Ashley Flynn began as a mystery framed by absence. No clear intruder. No obvious struggle that matched the story initially told. Only silence in the spaces where answers should have been. Before we go further into the details of that night, I want to welcome you to the channel. We look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we begin this journey together, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. Long before investigators examined phone records or questioned timelines, Ashley Flynn existed within the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. Those who knew her often described a steadiness about her presence. She worked as a teacher, a role that demanded patience and attention to the small details that shape young lives. The students remembered the tone of her voice, the way she encouraged effort rather than perfection. In a classroom, influence often moves invisibly. It is measured not by dramatic moments, but by the gradual accumulation of small acts of guidance. Ashley understood that rhythm well. She also understood the responsibilities of family life. Friends saw a mother navigating the overlapping demands of work, home, and community. Photographs taken during ordinary weekends showed familiar scenes. A child's birthday celebration, a quiet dinner table, smiles that appeared unforced. The kinds of images that populate thousands of social media timelines, each suggesting that life is moving forward in a predictable direction. Predictability can be comforting, but it can also conceal deeper tensions that remain invisible to outsiders. The life Ashley shared with Caleb Flynn was rooted in faith. Caleb served as a pastor, a role that carried expectations of moral clarity and emotional guidance. And in many communities, a pastor represents stability, the person people turn to when marriages struggle, when grief appears without warning, when uncertainty makes everyday decisions feel overwhelming. Caleb had stood in front of congregations, speaking about responsibility and compassion. He had prayed with families who faced their own private crises. That public identity matters when trying to understand the shock that would ripple through Tipp City after Ashley's death. Because the contrast between public roles and private realities can be difficult for communities to reconcile. A pastor's home is often imagined as a place where faith shields the family from deeper fractures. But homes are complex environments. Inside them, expectations accumulate. Responsibilities grow heavier. Silence sometimes replaces conversation. In the months leading up to Ashley Flynn's death, subtle patterns were beginning to shift. These shifts were not dramatic. No sudden public confrontations. No loud arguments that spilled into public spaces. Instead, what investigators would later identify were quieter indicators. Emotional withdrawal, divided attention, the gradual formation of a private world that existed alongside the public one. Digital communication records would later suggest that Caleb Flynn had developed a relationship with another woman. Affairs rarely begin with a single decision. They evolve through small moments of attention that slowly reshape emotional priorities. Conversations that once belonged to a spouse migrate elsewhere. The emotional weight of responsibility begins to feel heavier compared to the lighter atmosphere of a new connection. In the early stages, these relationships often exist entirely in messages. Words exchanged through phones create a sense of intimacy without the physical realities that define everyday life. Responsibilities remain somewhere else. Bills, schedules, disagreements, and obligations belong to the existing world. The new connection offers something different. It feels uncomplicated, supportive, free of expectation. Over time, that contrast can reshape the way a person sees their own life. What once felt stable begins to feel restrictive. The ordinary demands of family life start to appear heavier when compared with the imagined freedom of another future, which investigators would later examine hundreds of digital interactions in the days and weeks surrounding Ashley's death. Within those messages, prosecutors would identify a line that eventually became central to their theory of the crime. A message sent by Caleb Flynn to the woman he had been communicating with. The message was brief, only a few words, but its timing would raise profound questions. According to investigators, that text read, "It's almost done." When that message was sent, Ashley Flynn was still alive. 2 hours later, she would be dead. At the time the text was sent, there was no emergency call, no frantic message asking for help, no evidence of a sudden burglary unfolding inside the home. Only the calm transmission of a phrase that investigators believed suggested foreknowledge. When detectives first encountered that message, they were not yet ready to interpret it as evidence of murder. Investigations rarely begin with conclusions. Instead, they move cautiously through layers of possibility. Context matters, timing matters, and sometimes messages that appear ominous at first glance later reveal innocent explanations. But the message remained in the file as other details emerge, and as those details accumulated, its meaning began to feel less ambiguous. The night Ashley Flynn died began quietly. Neighbors would later report nothing unusual in the early evening hours. No loud confrontation. No obvious disturbance that might suggest an unfolding tragedy. Inside the home, however, a disagreement had occurred. According to Caleb Flynn's later statement, he and Ashley had argued. Arguments are common in marriages. They reflect stress, frustration, and the collision of two lives navigating shared responsibilities. Caleb would tell investigators that the argument ended with Ashley asking him to sleep on the couch. Again, this detail seemed unremarkable at first glance. Couples often create temporary physical distance during disagreements. The couch becomes a symbolic boundary meant to allow emotions to settle. In many cases, that distance lasts only a single night. Mourning brings conversation, apology, or quiet reconciliation. But in this story, mourning would bring something very different. At some point after that argument, Ashley Flynn was shot inside her home. And the exact sequence of moments between the argument and the gunshot would later become one of the most contested elements of the case. Investigators would search for physical evidence that could establish a clear timeline. They examined the layout of the home, the position of objects, the location where Ashley's body was discovered. They also examined the initial report given to authorities. Caleb Flynn called emergency services and described what he believed had happened. According to that account, an intruder had entered the home, a burglary that turned violent. Home invasions do occur, Police officers are trained to consider them seriously whenever a death occurs inside a residence. But certain details quickly began to complicate that narrative. Detectives who arrived at the scene looked for signs that someone had forced their way inside. Broken locks, damaged doors, disturbed windows. Evidence that a stranger had moved quickly through the house searching for valuables. What they found instead was something quieter. Doors and windows that appeared intact. Rooms that showed no clear evidence of frantic searching. The absence of forced entry does not automatically eliminate the possibility of an intruder. Some burglars enter through unlocked doors or open windows, but investigators consider the totality of the scene. They look for patterns that align with known behavior. In a typical burglary, time is limited. Intruders move quickly, grabbing items that can be carried easily and sold quickly. Electronics, jewelry, cash. In this case, investigators struggled to identify anything significant that had been taken. That absence of theft created a subtle tension in the story being told. If someone had entered the home intending to steal, why had they left empty-handed? And if theft had not been the goal, why had they entered at all? Detectives began to examine Caleb Flynn's timeline more closely. They asked questions about the argument he described. When exactly had it occurred? What words had been exchanged? At what point had he moved to the couch? These questions were not accusations yet. They were simply part of the investigative process that follows any unexplained death. Caleb's demeanor during those early interactions would later become part of the broader narrative prosecutors presented in court. Witnesses described him as calm, composed. That calmness can be interpreted in many ways. Some people respond to trauma by becoming emotionally numb. Others detach from overwhelming events as a form of psychological protection. Investigators must be careful not to misinterpret shock as guilt, yet behavior is still observed and recorded because patterns sometimes emerge when combined with other evidence. As the investigation continued, detectives turned increasingly toward digital records. Phones have become silent witnesses in modern investigations. They track movements, preserve conversations, record the timing of messages sent and received. In many cases, they reveal patterns that individuals never expect investigators to see. Caleb Flynn's phone contained a record of his communications with the woman prosecutors would later identify as his mistress. And the relationship between them appeared to have developed over time through messages that carried an emotional intimacy not typical of casual friendship. Those messages painted a picture of a private world existing alongside Caleb's public life as a husband and pastor. The text reading, "It's almost done," sat within that record like a quiet anomaly. Detectives compared its timestamp to other events that evening. They measured its distance from the emergency call reporting Ashley's death. And they considered what someone might mean by those words. Could it refer to the end of a conversation, the conclusion of a task, or something more deliberate? As investigators revisited the physical evidence inside the home, the burglary narrative continued to weaken. Scenes staged to resemble intrusions often reveal small inconsistencies. Objects moved in ways that do not match typical burglar behavior. Entry points that appear manipulated after the fact. Investigators are trained to notice these details because staging requires the person creating the illusion to think like a criminal while also protecting themselves from suspicion. That dual objective often produces mistakes. Over time, prosecutors would argue that the burglary scene inside the Flynn home had been staged to support a story that could not withstand careful scrutiny. And the argument between Ashley and Caleb that night began to look different when viewed through the lens of the text message sent hours earlier. The phrase, "It's almost done," no longer appeared ambiguous. Instead, it seemed to suggest that something had been planned, something approaching completion. For investigators, the challenge was proving that interpretation beyond speculation. Criminal cases are built on evidence that must withstand rigorous legal examination. Suspicion alone is not enough. Prosecutors would eventually construct a theory that placed Caleb Flynn at the center of Ashley's death. According to that theory, the life he had built, marriage, family, pastoral responsibilities, had begun to feel incompatible with the alternate future he imagined with another woman. Divorce carries financial, emotional, and social consequences, especially within communities that place strong value on marital permanence. Ending a marriage openly can fracture reputations and relationships. But violence is not a solution born from desperation alone. It requires a decision, A moment when someone convinces themselves that removing another human being will create the freedom they believe they deserve. That psychological shift rarely occurs suddenly. It emerges through patterns of avoidance, problems left unresolved, fantasies about escape that gradually replace the work required to repair a life. When prosecutors later presented their case, they emphasized this distinction carefully, and they did not describe the killing of Ashley Flynn as a moment of uncontrollable rage. Instead, they framed it as an act of control, a deliberate attempt to remove an obstacle standing between Caleb Flynn and the future he imagined. Inside the courtroom, the quiet sentence Caleb had offered investigators returned once again. "We had a fight that night. She asked me to sleep on the couch." It still sounded ordinary, but by that point it existed alongside other facts. The text message sent hours earlier, the absence of forced entry, the staged elements of the scene, the digital trail connecting Caleb to a secret relationship that promised a different life. Each piece alone might have left room for doubt. Together, they formed a pattern investigators believed they could explain. The tragedy of Ashley Flynn's death cannot be measured solely through legal arguments or investigative timelines. Behind every piece of evidence exists a human life that ended abruptly inside a place that should have been safe. Friends remembered Ashley not as a victim defined by the way she died, but as a person whose presence shaped the lives around her. Students remembered encouragement offered during difficult lessons. Family members remembered quiet conversations that strengthened bonds over time. Communities often struggle to reconcile these memories with the darker realities uncovered during criminal investigations. The image of a stable family life dissolves slowly as evidence emerges. Faith leaders who once guided others become subjects of scrutiny. And a sentence that initially sounded like a simple explanation transforms into something more troubling. Because sometimes the most revealing statements are the ones that appear harmless at first glance. Sometimes the truth hides inside ordinary words, waiting for investigators to place them beside the evidence that gives them meaning. As the case against Caleb Flynn moved forward, prosecutors would continue building their argument around those patterns of evidence. They would examine every message, every movement, every decision made in the hours leading up to Ashley's death. And through that process, they hoped to show a jury that this tragedy was not the result of chance or intrusion. It was the result of choice, a choice that ended a life and reshaped the quiet community of Tipp City forever. In the hours after the emergency call, the quiet neighborhood in Tipp City settled into the uneasy stillness that follows a tragedy no one expected. Patrol cars had come and gone. Investigators had taken photographs, gathered evidence, and begun the slow work of documenting a scene that no longer made sense as a burglary. But outside the house, life still moved forward with the ordinary rhythm of a small city waking up to another day. Children boarded school buses, commuters drove toward nearby highways. People who had not yet heard the news passed by the Flynn home without realizing that something irreversible had happened behind its walls. Inside the investigation, however, the quiet surface of that morning concealed a growing recognition among detectives that the story they had been given was beginning to collapse. The first hours of a homicide investigation are often defined by uncertainty. Officers must treat every possibility with caution. A burglary can turn violent. A stranger can enter a home without leaving obvious signs. But as investigators continued examining the environment surrounding the death of Ashley Flynn, the possibility of an unknown intruder felt increasingly distant. The house itself resisted that explanation. There were no broken windows that suggested forced entry. No shattered locks. No door frames splintered by someone trying to force their way inside. Instead, the structure of the home remained almost entirely undisturbed. The calm of the scene carried a subtle contradiction. Violence had occurred inside, yet the environment surrounding that violence seemed strangely composed. Detectives began documenting every object within the rooms: furniture positions, the placement of personal belongings, the absence of the chaotic disarray typical of a burglary. Experienced investigators often speak about the way certain scenes feel, not in a mystical sense, but in the pattern recognition that comes from years of examining crimes. When a scene has been staged, small details often fail to align with the story they are meant to support. A drawer pulled open but containing valuables still inside. A door slightly ajar when a burglar would likely have moved quickly through the space. These details are not proof by themselves, but they create questions that investigators cannot ignore. In this case, those questions began accumulating quickly. While forensic teams continued working inside the home, detectives also began constructing a timeline of the final hours of Ashley Flynn's life. That timeline would rely heavily on digital evidence. Modern investigations frequently unfold through the silent data preserved on phones, computers, and communication networks. Each message sent, each call made, each interaction recorded by a device creates a trace that can later be examined with precision. When investigators obtained access to the phone belonging to Caleb Flynn, they encountered a pattern of communication that would gradually reshape their understanding of the case. Messages between Caleb and another woman revealed a relationship that extended far beyond casual acquaintance. The language contained within those exchanges suggested emotional intimacy. Plans discussed quietly, shared frustrations, moments of reassurance that often appear in relationships built outside the boundaries of marriage. Affairs rarely begin with a single declaration. They emerge through incremental steps. Conversations that begin as harmless gradually deepen into something more personal. Over time, those conversations create a parallel emotional life that exists alongside the visible one. For Caleb Flynn, that parallel life had begun to occupy a growing portion of his attention. And the messages investigators reviewed suggested a man increasingly invested in the idea of a future that did not include the responsibilities of his current life. That shift in attention is not uncommon in affairs. What begins as a temporary escape from routine responsibilities can gradually transform into a fantasy about permanent change. Within that fantasy, obstacles begin to appear. Commitments that once seemed meaningful now feel restrictive. Obligations that once defined purpose begin to feel like barriers preventing the imagined future from becoming real. Prosecutors would later argue that this psychological shift formed the foundation of the crime that followed. They would describe a man who had slowly detached from the life he had built, replacing it with a vision that seemed easier, lighter, and free from the obligations that marriage and parenthood inevitably bring. Within that context, the text message sent on the night of Ashley's death took on a darker significance. The message was brief. 4 words that might have seemed meaningless in isolation. "It's almost done." Investigators studied the timestamp attached to that message with extraordinary care. It had been sent approximately 2 hours before the emergency call reporting Ashley's death. At that moment, there was no indication that a burglary had occurred, no alarm raised, no frantic attempt to contact authorities. Only the quiet transmission of a sentence that suggested something approaching completion. Detectives began comparing that message with other elements of the timeline. When had Caleb last spoken with Ashley before the reported argument? How long had the disagreement lasted? What events occurred between the time he claimed to have moved to the couch and the moment he called emergency services? Reconstructing those moments required careful examination of digital records, physical evidence, and witness statements. Each source of information offered small pieces of a larger puzzle investigators were trying to assemble. Meanwhile, the community surrounding the Flynn family struggled to reconcile the emerging details with the image they had long held of Caleb Flynn. As a pastor, he had occupied a position of trust within the congregation he served. Pastors often become deeply integrated into the lives of those around them. They officiate weddings, lead prayers during funerals, offer counsel during moments of crisis. When someone who occupies that role becomes the subject of a criminal investigation, the shock can ripple far beyond the immediate family involved. Members of the congregation found themselves confronting a painful uncertainty. Could the man who had spoken about compassion and responsibility truly be connected to the death of his own wife? Or was the investigation misinterpreting the evidence surrounding a tragedy that had another explanation? Communities often resist the idea that violence can emerge from within familiar spaces. The concept of an unknown intruder, while frightening, sometimes feels easier to accept than the possibility that harm originated inside the home itself. But investigators are trained to follow evidence wherever it leads, and in this case, the evidence increasingly pointed toward a scenario that did not involve an outside attacker. Forensic analysis continued examining the physical aspects of the crime scene. The placement of Ashley Flynn's body, the trajectory of the bullet, and the surrounding environment all contributed to the reconstruction of the event that had taken place. Ballistics experts evaluated the firearm involved, Crime scene technicians documented the smallest details, aware that a single overlooked element could later become significant in court. Over time, the burglary narrative presented during the initial emergency call began to unravel under the weight of these findings. And investigators concluded that there was no credible evidence that an unknown person had entered the home that night. Instead, the circumstances suggested that the scene had been manipulated to resemble an intrusion after the fact. Staging a crime scene is rarely flawless. The person attempting to create the illusion must imagine how a stranger might behave while also protecting themselves from suspicion. That balancing act often produces subtle inconsistencies. In this case, prosecutors would later argue that the inconsistencies within the Flynn home reflected exactly that kind of staging attempt. The absence of stolen property, the intact entry points, and the overall condition of the house all contradicted the story of a violent burglary. When detectives confronted Caleb Flynn with questions about these inconsistencies, his responses became part of the investigative record that would later be examined in court. Statements given during interviews often reveal more than the words themselves. Investigators listen for changes in tone, shifts in explanation, and the gradual emergence of contradictions that may indicate a story struggling to remain consistent. According to the prosecution's later narrative, Caleb's account of the night continued evolving as investigators presented him with new information. The argument with Ashley remained central to his explanation. He described tension in the relationship, a disagreement that had escalated before she asked him to sleep on the couch. But as detectives examined the timeline more closely, the simplicity of that explanation began to fracture. The text message sent earlier that evening lingered in the background of every question. What had been almost done? Why had that phrase been sent before any emergency had occurred? And why had the message been directed to the woman investigators now understood to be Caleb's mistress? Digital evidence would soon deepen the significance of that question. Investigators discovered that certain messages had been deleted from Caleb's phone following Ashley's death. While deletion does not automatically imply guilt, it often attracts investigative attention because it suggests an attempt to remove information from the record. Fortunately for investigators, modern forensic tools can sometimes recover fragments of deleted communication. Even when messages themselves cannot be restored fully, metadata often preserves the timing and frequency of those interactions. Through that analysis, detectives began building a clearer picture of Caleb Flynn's communications in the days surrounding Ashley's death. The pattern suggested a man deeply invested in maintaining a connection with someone outside his marriage. Conversations with the other woman carried emotional intensity that contrasted sharply with the distance investigators believed had grown within his relationship with Ashley. Prosecutors would later frame this contrast as a central element of motive. The life Caleb had built as a husband and father represented responsibility, routine, and accountability. The relationship with his mistress offered something very different, a sense of escape, a future imagined without the obligations that defined his current existence. That imagined future, prosecutors argued, became powerful enough to reshape the way Caleb viewed the people who depended on him. Within that perspective, Ashley Flynn ceased to represent a partner in a shared life. Instead, she became an obstacle standing between Caleb and the future he believed he deserved. Violence born from that mindset is rarely impulsive. It reflects a calculation in which the removal of another person appears to solve a problem rather than create one. When the case eventually moved into the courtroom, the prosecution carefully constructed this psychological narrative for the jury. They emphasized that the death of Ashley Flynn was not the result of an uncontrollable outburst. It was, they argued, the culmination of a series of decisions. Decisions shaped by secrecy, emotional detachment, and the growing influence of a relationship that existed outside the marriage. The defense, meanwhile, challenged these conclusions. They questioned whether the evidence truly established premeditation beyond reasonable doubt. They raised the possibility that investigators had misinterpreted digital communication, that phrases such as "it's almost done" could refer to ordinary matters unrelated to violence. Criminal trials often hinge on exactly these kinds of interpretive conflicts. Evidence rarely speaks entirely for itself. It must be presented within a narrative framework that explains why certain details matter. The prosecution's framework suggested deliberate planning and calculated staging. The defense argued that the same evidence could support less sinister explanations. Throughout the trial, the figure of Ashley Flynn remained central to the proceedings, though she could no longer speak for herself. Friends and family members offered testimony describing the life she had built. They spoke about her work as a teacher, the patience she showed with students, and the devotion she brought to her role as a mother. These testimonies served an important purpose. Trials often focus heavily on the actions of the accused, but they also remind juries that behind every piece of evidence lies a human life that has been lost. Ashley Flynn's life had been defined not by the manner of her death, but by the relationships she nurtured during the years she lived. Those who knew her described a person who believed in stability, in family, and in the quiet routines that shape a meaningful life. The contrast between that image and the violence that ended her life created a gravity that lingered throughout the courtroom. As closing arguments approached, prosecutors returned once again to the quiet sentence Caleb Flynn had offered investigators in the earliest stages of the case. And we had a fight that night. She asked me to sleep on the couch. In isolation, the sentence still sounded ordinary, but by the end of the trial, it existed alongside a much larger body of evidence. The text message sent hours before Ashley's death, the absence of forced entry into the home, the staged elements of the scene, the digital record of a relationship that promised Caleb Flynn an alternate future. When combined, prosecutors argued, these pieces formed a coherent explanation. Ashley Flynn's death had not been the result of an intruder. It had been the result of a decision made inside the very home where she expected to be safe. The jury was tasked with determining whether that explanation had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Their decision would carry profound consequences, not only for Caleb Flynn, but also for the memory of the woman whose life had been taken. Regardless of the legal outcome, the deeper questions raised by the case would continue echoing beyond the courtroom. How does a life built on faith and public trust fracture into secrecy and violence? How does someone entrusted with guiding others through moral uncertainty arrive at a decision that destroys their own family? These questions rarely produce satisfying answers. Human behavior is shaped by layers of experience, emotion, and rationalization that can be difficult to unravel completely. But one truth remains clear within the tragedy that unfolded in Tipp City. The death of Ashley Flynn was not an accident. It was not the unpredictable chaos of a stranger's intrusion. According to prosecutors and the evidence they presented, it was the result of a deliberate pursuit of control. Control over the direction of a life that had begun to feel restrictive. Control over the future imagined with another person. Control achieved through the irreversible act of removing the one individual who stood in the way. In the end, explanations can never fully restore what has been lost. A courtroom verdict can establish responsibility, but it cannot return the voice of the woman whose life ended inside that quiet home. The legacy that remains belongs to Ashley Flynn herself, a teacher whose influence lived in the students she encouraged, a mother whose presence shaped the early memories of her child, a daughter and friend whose absence now occupies spaces once filled with ordinary conversation and shared moments. For the community of Tipp City, the case serves as a reminder that violence does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly within the spaces people assume are safest. Sometimes it hides behind routine and familiarity until the moment it finally reveals itself. And sometimes the most revealing evidence emerges not from dramatic confessions, but from the quiet accumulation of details that slowly illuminate the truth. The story of Ashley Flynn asks us to remember that silence can conceal as much danger as anger, that entitlement and avoidance can become destructive when allowed to grow unchecked, and that some crimes are not sudden explosions of emotion. They are exits carefully constructed by someone seeking freedom at any cost. If you've stayed with this story until the end, I thank you for taking the time to remember Ashley Flynn and the life she lived beyond the tragedy that ended it. Here on Cold Case Chronicles, our goal is not only to examine the evidence left behind in cases like this, but also to honor the people whose voices were taken away. If you believe stories like Ashley's deserve to be remembered and understood, consider subscribing to the channel. Share this video with someone who values thoughtful, respectful, true crime storytelling. And if this case moved you in any way, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from tonight. Because even when these tragedies occur in a single town, the truth they reveal reaches far beyond it.